Untitled Chapter on stage. For 2 years of COVID. So it's all, now they're getting their posts.
Okay, I'm going to start right on time.
Okay.
Great to see you all. Welcome, my name is Kate Cooney, and I'm excited to present to you today some glimpses into a new class that I've been teaching over the past 4 years here at the Yale School of Management. I've been here for 10 years, and one of the classes, I teach a suite of electives. And one of the classes that I teach is a class on urban poverty and inclusive economic development in U.S. cities. And I usually start that class by introducing myself through the cities I've lived in. So I thought I would do that with you today and tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the 70s and 80s. Washington, D.C. At that time was very impacted by the crack cocaine epidemic, by gun violence. It was a very segregated city, a majority black city, but so segregated that I could grow up in an almost homogeneously white experience. In a murder capital of the country, not really experiencing any violence in my daily life or being touched by it. But my parents were very active in social justice circles, and so I would participate in citywide youth kind of conferences, and it became very clear to me that despite all the anti-poor rhetoric that was typical of the era, there were my contemporaries, young people growing up in these impacted neighborhoods that were very mature, very active, really leaders in the city and in their communities. And similarly, in our bubbles of privilege, it was very clear to me that although we were being groomed to be leaders, there was an undercurrent of toxicity, of substance abuse, of sexism, and so forth. From DC, I moved to Holy Cross, third generation Cooney, to go to Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. And so here I see a deindustrialized city, right? A city that was really on hard times in the 90s, but you can see all around it vestiges of an earlier era, an era where economic vitality and wealth were flowing through the region. And you can see that in a world-class art museum, in research universities, in wonderful hospital and research institutes. From Worcester, I moved out to Los Angeles. I did something called the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and I worked with a group of really radical feminists who had set up a first shelter for mentally ill women who were homeless. So that was the first in the country to have a women-only space for that population. Within a couple of years, I went on to get my master's degree and then a PhD from the School of Public Affairs at UCLA. And it was there that, for the first time in my life, I was a minority, racial minority in an academic learning environment. So it was an incredibly diverse class I was in, and it was, bar none, the most exciting, electric, intellectual experience of my life, to be thinking about these big issues, about social welfare and policy and planning in such a diverse set of student body. When I was in Los Angeles, welfare reform had just occurred, and so I was able to participate in some of the first studies following women off of welfare and into the labor market and seeing that labor market dynamics up close. And I became particularly interested in organizations that were nonprofits but might have started businesses and were using those businesses to train welfare recipients or provide those first jobs. And I heard about this Professor Sharon Oster at the Yale School of Management who was running a business plan contest for nonprofits. So early in my first professorship at BU, I went down to New York with my ethnographer field notebook and went to a big thing that Sharon and others planned at the Ritz, having 20 finalists of that nonprofit business plan contest that they did present their nonprofit business plans, and then a whole group of SOM alum, I believe, but also faculty voted on who was going to win the, I think, $500,000 or $100,000 in cash, but also maybe even more valuable, free consulting from SOM alums. So 10 years later, when my husband and I, dual academic couple, were on the job market, he was already here at Yale. They shopped my CV around, Sharon saw it, and I've been here ever since.
Did you win the contest?
Well, I was only studying those that were applying for that. Yeah. So being here in New Haven and raising my kids in New Haven, it's very poignant because there was this sense of progress I had as a kind of just post-civil rights kid, growing up with this narrative that we were moving toward, we were in this linear path of progress on some of these issues. I was at that 1983 commemorative march, and then to be raising my kids in a city that feels similar in many ways to the DC of my youth, a very segregated city, a city where wealth and poverty are highly correlated with race, and a city where you could exist in this bubble of privilege and raise your kids in that if you choose to. And so that's really motivated my research agenda. I have a whole set of early research thinking about hybrid organizations, commercial nonprofits, market-based efforts at social change. And then more recently, although I've been teaching in this area for a long time, this area of inclusive economic development in US cities, beginning to marry a research agenda with that teaching area. I'm here to tell you about a lab extension of that very academic class that I teach on urban poverty and inclusive economic development in US cities. And in that class, we think about urban economics, we think about how the economic base of a city can rise and decline over time and has to be thoughtfully revitalized for a new era. The students do a census analysis of a city of their choosing, and they look at how wealth and poverty lay out geographically. Many students choose their hometown or a city they're going to. And then in the second half of that course, we do just some verticals thinking about affordable housing, workforce development, pillars of economic development. And as I'll tell you in a minute, a few years ago, I began thinking about a lab application of that course and taking just one theme of this big survey and exploring it with partners in New Haven. So that's called the Inclusive Economic Development Lab course. But before I get into that, let's just take a step back and think about the role of universities in their towns or city regions. What are some of the ways that a university can benefit a city in which it's located? And where might there be tensions between an anchor institution like a university and its host city?
I think maybe a large part of how it can benefit is if the host city, say, is already in a position of relative affluence where it can provide jobs for those graduates, because then you have almost like a ready-made reservoir of educated younger people who to fill jobs that are already in a city. And it's, I think, a much more creative relationship where the city can't provide jobs. Then I feel like it's almost like people come, they take resources from the city, and they kind of go somewhere else.
Okay, so holding on to those graduates and revitalizing that talent base can be beneficial, but when you can't do that, a more negative dynamic could occur, right? This has certainly been Boston's key to success, and it was Bruce Alexander who was the first appointed position of state and New Haven affairs. This was one of his key strategies that he was hoping to encourage. Other thoughts? Yes?
I think a tension that can occur is the image of the university in the city, especially in the case of Yale, for example. If you have a wealthy university in a poor city, which is what New Haven is, the images that are perceived by the poor population of the wealthy institution can be detrimental to making progress.
Okay, so there can be a kind of divide that can be hard to bridge.
I don't
Yes.
think that,
The university could buy up land and take it off the tax base. I mean, that's true for Boston in a big way, as well as here, I'm sure.
Yeah, so that's one of the our current mayor, Mayor Elliker's arguments about that animated his campaign for mayor was that so much of the tax base in New Haven is lowered by the amount of land that Yale owns. And as a nonprofit, you're given these kind of tax relief because of the public good that you're creating. And I've heard him talk about why is New Haven bearing the brunt of the cost subsidizing that public good when it's a public good that accrues to the world, right? And I thought that was an interesting way of making that.
And I would
That
imagine
argument.
to a specific class way more than any other class, right?
Mhm.
So it's not well spread out, the benefit of a Yale education.
A concentrated benefit.
Yeah.
Yes.
very similar to what she was saying.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say that my there are signs all over New Haven for when Mayor Elliker runs saying Yale respect New Haven. And my 16-year-old thought, wasn't that nice of the university to let New Haven know how much it respected? I said, no, you're missing an X. Yeah.
So on the positive side, you create demand and help small businesses. If you have a ready-made consumer base that's just there through the university. On the negative side, housing becomes very tricky, especially if a university is rapidly grown and then housing spills over into the local community.
Yeah, there was someone we interviewed for the lab in Los Angeles who was telling us about a neighborhood near USC where she had been working for many decades and how she saw as the students encroached into that neighborhood, how quickly landlords flipped their strategy because it's so much more rent you can get when students are willing to have 4 in a 4-bedroom or 3 in a 3-bedroom and pay up to $1,000 each versus a household that was paying rent for that it was almost overnight that the neighborhood switched.
I think it could go both ways depending on what the nature of the surrounding community is. So in New Haven, of course, that can create an affordable housing issue. But I went to undergrad in Northwest DC, where it's a very wealthy community already. And so then the local people there are worried about their home values decreasing because all of a sudden you have students living everywhere.
Mm-hmm. So they can organize to reduce the amount of new housing that's built or multifamily housing that's built or not allow a lot of apartments in the area.
I think that happened with Berkeley recently. You see Berkeley, they want to court kids. It's like stopping development at the university saying not enough houses started.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think there's an interesting workforce benefit that accrues to some of these towns when sort of the spouses and partners that come with the people into the university and enter the workforce in, management of the town and the education system and the businesses around here. And I think you get some interesting sort of development in other areas of the sector outside of the university.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. It's a real opportunity if a city or a university can create ways to take advantage of that potential. One of the things that Doug Ray has written about and talked about is the struggle a university like Yale has to recruit dual academics because there's not many other academic jobs in the area. Yes.
I think a potential tension is also that there's a distinct bifurcation in the income of the people who are associated with the professional class at the university and the locals, and and the opportunity to move from one part of that job force to the other, that, raises a lot of tension.
Mm-hmm. So you see these national trends in our economy, the hollowing out of middle-class jobs and so forth, landing in a very small city in very close quarters, and it can create a lot of tensions. Yes? Go ahead.
I think adding on to the point about the jobs for graduates is that the universities have such a critical role in inspiring the next generation, but even starting earlier. So the impact on the local schools, even the really, really young kids, there's so much that can be done to really inspire and nurture these kids from the influence from the universities. So imagine sort of career type experiences and things like that could make such a big impact as well. So.
Right, really leading with the mission of the school and then sharing out some of that core product or service with the local stakeholder. Yes?
The university can direct some of its spending that would otherwise go to outside firms to local producers. We've seen this in some instances of producers of food, greens, for example, bought by local universities.
Yeah, I had a student, Boris Segal, who was really thinking a lot about this lever. And in the years after he graduated, he created a joint position between the City Economic Development Office and Bruce Alexander's shop here at Yale. And one of the things that he was able to do is he got all the supply chain data over the past 4 years, and he analyzed it. And one of the things he showed, which wasn't known to the university because they hadn't been tracking it, was that a decision to move to a national distributor for food in the dining halls, which solved a big problem for the university of lots of trucks on campus, lots of different ordering systems, streamlined all of that for the university. But the result that he was able to see was it took over $1 million out of the New Haven economy. And so when you're not tracking that, you don't see that, but it does impact. And reversing that is challenging when you have all of those benefits on the efficiency side that accrue through that decision. So I'll show you some ways you can hear that full conversation that he shared with us. But he spent a year trying to think about could they bend some of that supply chain back. And they did find food was a good area because student tastes, who are the key customer for the university in terms of food, were such that some specialty product locally grown would be attractive. And so they could justify that. But it was tricky, yes.
So I think that's why we probably see snacks from coffee, the nearby coffee shop.
Yeah.
University, a large research university like Yale can attract a lot of federal dollars, and a lot of private investment gets leveraged off of that as well.
Okay, and we do see, what started with the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute early on, thinking about how could faculty commercialize some of these federal research dollars into startups. Now we see a whole new initiative, Yale Ventures, which is really taking that early work and thinking about it in a renewed, robust way that really takes the city more into account as a key stakeholder.
Well, and one of the big growth areas in commercial real estate right now in New Haven is lab space.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been benefits to landlords and.
Yes. Yeah.
The university can be a model employer, especially for blue-collar workers. Typically, and hopefully, the most efficient way with that would be to accept a union drive, or as Yale has done, extend a model contract, 7-year contract.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and they say getting a job here in the custodial is harder than getting into Yale College, and it's a life-changing job for the region. Yes?
I think another source of tension is really a 3-part tension between the state the city and the university. And it's really has to do with the payments in lieu of taxes and educational cost sharing. If the state, and I can't tell you what they're doing this year because I know the coffers are full, but generally for all of the cities, they're not getting their payments in lieu of taxes. So if they don't get the revenues coming in on a consistent basis, the city is going to turn to Yale University and ask for a greater voluntary contribution, which the city has already done.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it was in some ways a shrewd negotiating strategy to press for the city, who was trying to pressure the state to give them their full pilot payment, which Yale and other nonprofits were paying, but to also pressure the university, who in turn maybe had more leverage with the state to, but it also coincided with some full coffers, which helped.
Right.
Okay, so we talked about all of these different ways that the university can serve as an anchor. This is from Boris's slide. So when he comes to talk to my class, he highlights these two roles of the purchaser and the employer, which have been underdeveloped at Yale. And he, for a few years, ran the New Haven Works initiative, which is aiming to get more New Haveners jobs at Yale, and had been working for a few years on that purchasing supply chain area. But for me, when I'm thinking about the work that we're doing at the classroom and expanding out a bridge from the academic class that I've been teaching with this lab, I've really been thinking a lot about the knowledge piece. How do we think together with communities? How do we share what we're learning, new ideas about inclusive economic development? How do they land in the community with others who are working on these issues? And how can we think about new things coming down the pike that we can all learn about together? So that was the spirit with which I began the Inclusive Economic Development Lab. And I'm going to not spend too much time on this, but the reason I started thinking about it is because in that academic class, I had been working with a local agency, the new Financial Empowerment Center, and in that class, the students can do anything for their final project. But for a couple of years in a row, I designed one option that 9 of them could opt into that we scoped for them with the city. And it was working with this new Financial Empowerment Center. In the first year, that team did some work mapping the different kinds of ways low-income New Haveners accessed financial services and mapped them out, like pawn shops and check cashing places and so forth, and also showed how little traditional banking was available throughout the city. They also did focus groups, and this was a very impactful experience for the students. They did focus groups with clients of the Financial Empowerment Center and asked them a series of questions about why they would choose a check cashing over a bank, and got some really interesting information from that. Another year, a group of students were asked to help with the marketing plan for the Financial Empowerment Center. So they looked at our mayor at the time, Tony Harp's materials, and noticed that they really focused the city a lot and not much about kind of what this center could do for you. So they recommended back to the city some examples of other financial empowerment centers in other cities, and how they kind of centered on the client, what the client could do with this financial empowerment coaching, and laid out a whole set of digital advertising that the center could use. And then a final project that we did for in that era was more academic. So a group of students worked with Annie, who was helping with the Financial Empowerment Center at the city, to help think about how do you build a debt map for the whole city, to really understand how much debt New Haveners are carrying and the different kinds of debt, and how many households are carrying how much levels of debt. And so our students chose one address in New Haven and then saw how much of the different kinds of debt they were able to track through publicly available databases. And that contributed to the work Annie was doing about the debt burden in New Haven. And at least one of those students went on to get their PhD at Princeton. It was a very, very highly rigorous white paper. And at the end of that semester, I was thinking so much of this work that the students are doing should be shared out in a broader way. It could really help inform others in New Haven. It could help inform others in other cities. And so that was what began to inspire me to think about this lab course. Our first opportunity came when this new initiative, the Opportunity Zone program, came down through the 2017 Jobs Act, and everybody was trying to figure out what it was. So we thought, well, this would be a nice opportunity to create a shared learning lab about this new program. Does anyone know what Opportunity Zones are?
Sure.
Does someone want to sum it up?
Tax advantages for areas that have been underdeveloped or poorly served from an economic perspective, and trying to bring to bear primarily tax advantages, but other directed, primarily federal government resources.
So what's exciting about this program? Why do you think there was so much buzz about it?
Well, it was another pool of resources that hadn't been available before. So it was advocated for, and I think promulgated with the notion that it would be used as a significant lever to bring other resources to the table.
Yeah.
And the discussion around whether it's been a good program or a bad program often is centered around whether or not, in fact, it has been leveraged, whether it's been effective in that or simply it's created tax shelters, if you will, that would have simply gone to benefit other tax sheltered investments rather than these, and that the development that was actually encouraged would have occurred in any case.
Yeah, so what do you think, so one of the things that people were really excited about is there was really no ceiling on this tax credit, right? And so if we think about the low-income housing tax credit or new market tax credits, they're rationed. They're given to a state based on their population. And if you ever look, as I sometimes do, to see how many units are actually created in any given year by these programs, the low-income housing tax credit, one of our most successful programs for building affordable housing, they're very few number given the need and the demand for affordable housing. This had no cap. It was whatever the appetite was for this capital gains relief. And there was quite a bit of capital gains unrealized on the books, a lot of tech stocks that appreciated and so forth that perhaps could be channeled into underinvested neighborhoods and create some development. Yeah.
What are the benefits of something that's geographically based in terms of incentives versus based on who benefits, whether it's in that neighborhood or not?
So you're asking, if we think about the low-income housing tax credit, there's no condition on where it gets built, although you could put that into the state guidelines for any given year. Whereas this is a very geographically bounded initiative, right? So how does that shape what happens with this program?
Yeah.
It's a great question. Any thoughts?
One of the biggest questions I have had over the years is that the greatest obstacle that I'm aware of to for local institutions and individuals, especially political leadership, to single out a particular area within a locality because it's been poorly developed over time, is one of singling out a particular area for a higher level of resources than everyone else. Everyone gets one vote, so to speak, in at least one sense of the word. So even to single out an area that's considered to be under-resourced doesn't satisfy all the other decision makers at the local level. And that is the primary tension. If you try to devote additional resources to one particular area, inevitably it gets watered down so that it can benefit a larger group across the entire decision-making area. It happens time and time again. For tax abatements being an example. Mm-hmm. If you try to target tax abatements in New Haven or in Philadelphia or in most cities, inevitably those tax abatements leak away from those areas that you were trying to target for development, and in fact go to areas where the development would have occurred anyway.
Mm-hmm. So this whole debate about place-based development happens at both of the angles that you're taking, right? So in your talk, thinking about equity and fairness, and why single out one neighborhood over another, right? And then at the same time, when you think about the history of these place-based programs, they haven't been very successful, right? And that's something that you hear economic development administrators talk about, is we have put so many millions of dollars into these set of neighborhoods, and yet the conditions remain the same. Sort of how can we think about this place-based, neighborhood-based revitalization in a different way? This program had another challenge because it was a national program. You could invest for that tax benefit in any of these 8,650 census tracts. Some of them were in places in California where property values were increasing at a rapid rate. Others, like New Haven, might have been in neighborhoods that hadn't seen appreciation for many decades, right? So the money flowed very unevenly to those set of census tracts for which the program's incentive would be maximized, right? And that it makes it different from the low-income housing tax credits, which you get at the state level, so they can only be allocated for state-based development. This was a national program. And part of the benefit was not only a step up in basis in your capital gains and deferred payment on your capital gains if you invested in a qualified investment in one of these 8,650 census tracts. So if you held it 5 years, you got a step up in basis of 10%. If you held it 7 years, 15%. If you held it 10 years, anything that any rise in value, any appreciation of that investment also came out tax-free. So that 10-year hold was really valuable. But it was such a new program. There were a lot of investors sat on the sidelines. It was a lot of new players coming in to figure out how do we put together deals in these neighborhoods. That's the problem, is that many of them had not had a lot of investment activity. And so there was a kind of timing issue of how, if you didn't get in soon, you weren't going to get that full 10-year benefit. But where was the deal that was going to maximize your align with your risk tolerance? And so we saw a lot of investment on the West Coast, basically. But what we were interested in doing is learning together with the city about understanding the limits of this program. How might you organize at the city level to take advantage of this and maybe attract impact investors or people who care about New Haven who might want to participate in a program like this. So the lab was designed, and the elements of that first lab have continued through the 4 labs we've held. It was designed around this one theme that we were going to investigate. We started by interviewing people in different cities to hear about what they were doing to mobilize around opportunity zones. And we made a podcast sharing those conversations out. So we were really always thinking about both capturing knowledge and sharing it out to as broad set of stakeholders as we could. And the students wrote the scripts and we recorded the narrations for that podcast. And then we partnered with the city plan agency. Aisha Woods at the time was heading that agency in the city of New Haven. And we also partnered Sci-City, who is a newer institute on campus that's about social inclusion and social impact. And so they sponsored a community forum. So we would have speakers come into town, speak to our class, record our podcast, and then go give a third talk to this group of New Haven folks who were also interested in hearing about what they were doing relative to this new program. And we interviewed a number of developers. We interviewed folks who were doing really creative impact investing involving community members, making decisions about what investments were green-lighted in their community. We also thought about organizing our work that first year to really explore a specific set of models that might lend themselves to community benefit if an opportunity investment was made in it. So, for example, we looked at, do I have it here? We looked at 4 models. So we looked at a big question many were asking, can affordable housing be married with the Opportunity Zone program? So we explored that. We looked at fab labs and maker spaces to see if those kind of models would lend themselves well to Opportunity Zone investment. We looked at food halls, and then we looked broadly at business investment, and that was one of the qualified investments that you could make. And the students went out to the community management team meetings in New Haven in 4 of our Opportunity Zone areas. They talked about their project, they advertised the different learnings they were having, and we had some community forums where we shared back both what the students concluded from their investigation over that semester, but we also wanted to create an artifact or something that could be used by local stakeholders. So what we did was we noticed there were national intermediaries recommending that cities, the way to get ready for this Opportunity Zone program is to create a prospectus at the Opportunity Zone level for each zone to talk about some basic statistics, a little bit of basic census facts about that neighborhood. I'm just showing you one of the prospectuses the students created. And then give a sense of what's the momentum, what other development is occurring in that neighborhood, and what are some of the Opportunity Zone investments available in that neighborhood. So the students created these 3-slide prospectuses for each of the Opportunity Zones, and the idea was anybody in the city who was putting a deal together could use those as the front of their deck and then build out the back of their deck to do their thing. And then we had a forum at the end where we invited folks from the state, from the city to come and hear about their analyses. So just to keep the example going forward, one of the teams who was looking at Dixwell thought food halls would make would be a great thing to invest in Dixwell. Talked about the benefits of food halls, highlighted one in South LA, the Mercado La Paloma, that really centered community benefit in its food hall model. They had all these nonprofits who are now national names, Black Lives Matter, some death penalty organizing that are making national headlines, upstairs, renting the upstairs, and then they had a whole set of long-term ethnic restaurants downstairs that allowed the community to have traditional meals and rent out the space for parties and weddings and things like that. And they recommended it for Dixwell. Dixwell's a food desert, and it can also, food can be a place that brings a lot of different parts of the city together in one space, and talk through how an OZ financing might fit with that. Then we produced our podcast, and as I'll show you some of the highlights from the sessions the labs we've done since this first one, every year the most downloaded podcasts are always the ones about housing. So this first year we had someone come talk about community land trusts, and we talked to someone in New Orleans who was doing some very creative kind of next generation model of community land trusts, and also someone in the Lower East Side who's like the old guard who has had a 22 apartment building land trust right in Lower Manhattan since the 80s, and is struggling to keep it alive for the next generation. So it was very interesting conversations. And we heard a lot of great feedback from the folks that we worked with. Aisha used those prospectuses quite a bit, and we heard people like the podcast. We heard from Alfonso, Deputy Chief of Staff of HUD, that he had heard, I think he's a Yale connected person because they featured us in the Yale network. And I heard, also from another Yale alum who read about it and was using the stuff right away in her daily work. So those were gratifying to hear. Our second year, I'm going to just give you some highlights here, was the COVID lockdown. So I literally was in a classroom like this. Our topic that we picked for our second year was rethinking community engagement, the role of narratives in inclusive economic development. And we were thinking about the fact that community engagement is thought about as a main tool that you use in this work. But in some fields, like affordable housing, as we were just talking about, it can become the very thing that prevents housing from being produced, because so much of that engagement is too local, right? And so we interviewed some professors at the Yale Law School for whom this kind of thinking about levels of engagement is their academic area. We interviewed a group in Minneapolis that they're the first city to count the racial covenants in their metropolitan area. And the way they thought about using public engagement to really have that knowledge land with the population. So they thought about the choice of hiring a bunch of researchers and just counting them and getting the answer. But instead, they engaged the whole city in a year or two long detective story where every workshop, a different group would decode some of these housing covenants. And by the end of that, there was such a movement for undoing some of the zoning that is a legacy of those earlier eras that they became the first city to really rethink their single-family housing zoning code. So we just heard a lot of really exciting ways of doing community engagement while we were all in lockdown, which was, the irony wasn't lost on us. But at the end of that, we had some aspirations of maybe engaging at the neighborhood level, doing some again, thinking about producing an artifact like a one-pager based on this method of a community engagement called appreciative inquiry, where you begin to think about what do you love about your neighborhood, and then creating some artifacts, kind of in the spirit of what we did in the first lab, a prospectus that could be used for a set of actors who wanted to build on some of that initial work. We weren't able to do that because of COVID, but the students creatively did a few information interviews. We heard some great stories, both from the suburbs and from the city about New Haven. Some of my favorite ones are characters are what make the city what it is. Community turns out. Some meetings have people lining the walls, standing room only. There's one, I think it's a bumper sticker that says, "A city so small, even you can be somebody." And then we had them listen to a storytellers project. So they got a feel for some that happens in New Haven. So they got and they coded those. So these were shortcuts we had to take in COVID to kind of let the students go out and experience the city. And again, we had this kind of public share out of what we had learned. And we started calling it our public curriculum, right? A time when we invite people in to hear about all these things we've explored. And so we had, maybe because of COVID, like all of City Hall showed up for our virtual presentation, and the students talked about all the different things they had learned about, and always ended with how to think about that in New Haven, potential for the city. And we did our podcast, and again, the housing one was the big one. But at the end of that session, I thought the students had begun to do these analyses, thinking about zoning, how to rezone, like some of the cities like Minneapolis had done to get more affordable housing. But we just didn't have time to finish that work. So we had the opportunity to hire an RA that summer, and he built out those into mini white papers. And so that was great, but then the challenge was how to get those into the hands of people who were working on these issues. So I'll just skip through these quickly because I know we're running out of time. But he did, just to highlight a couple of things, was looking at what it would take to get to 25,000 new affordable housing units in the 16-town region of Southern Connecticut. And I think the big takeaway is that you can't do it without including the surrounding towns. So that 16,000 comes from everywhere else but New Haven, right? That top line number. Anything you can do on the edges in New Haven isn't going to get you to that 25,000, right? But he also looked at what would change about the character of those towns if you did upzone in this way. And he took examples from Oregon and from Minneapolis and other places that were experimenting with rezoning, and then modeled that. That was his back of the envelope. And you can see they still remain the majority single-family places. Not that that will assuage people who like to be much closer to 90% single-family, but the point was, you still have quite a bit of single-family left, even after producing 16,000 more affordable units in those 15 towns. Another white paper that he worked on took a student in the lab had done and extended it. We were looking at Louisville, Kentucky, and their regional work at equalizing funding for the schools. And so he followed their model and looked at it for New Haven, and what he found poetically was that if you did it, it would increase our per pupil from $1,859 to $20,250, creating a $35.5 million additional funding for the city of New Haven, which at that time, I kid you not, was exactly the deficit that the city public schools were trying to close. So that was a very powerful finding. And this is the experience of my students as well, by the way. I'm always running out of time in class. But so we did two more, and I just have a couple more points. I'm not going to spend as much time in these last two. But by our third lab, spring 2021, we were still virtual, as I recall. And we were struck by that statistic that many of us read in that New York Times article or wherever you might have seen it, and I remember waiting to see who was going to write this article about what was happening with Black businesses in the pandemic, but they were hit so hard. And so that set us off on our theme for that spring lab, which was supporting and scaling Black-owned and Black-led businesses. And here we got really ambitious with our podcast, and we went back in time. We thought about the history of this notion of Black capitalism, those early supplier programs coming out of the Nixon administration. And we talked to some of the researchers who had been either architects or evaluating programs since then. Some of them Yale faculty, some of them not. And then followed out into thinking about entrepreneurial ecosystems and cutting edge practices or new thinking about how to really build more inclusive supports for entrepreneurs. That lab, we worked more with clients. So we hadn't done that before. We were leaning more academic in the lab. Here we had a smaller group. I partnered with the Yale Ludwig Center for Community and Economic Development. We built some joint teams, and we worked with the Public Housing Authority, and we worked with the Black Business Alliance on some work scoped already. And I kept thinking about this question I had at the end of the last lab was, how do I take this work and bring it into the hands of people who are continuing to work on it? Because our students leave. I have to teach my next class. And so by this time we were getting a little more high profile. So the Community Foundation asked me, do you want to do this summer study with us? Everybody's thinking about that statistic about Black-owned business. We're doing a equitable ecosystem analysis in New Haven. I said yes, and then in that report, I could weave in everything we had learned from the lab, but present it to the people who were asking the question in a way that responded exactly to the things they were thinking about and informed by all the interviewing we did for that research project. So that, we were getting a little closer to moving the knowledge into the hands of people who could keep going with it. And then we're just finishing up our spring 2022 lab. We're back in the classroom, and given the big infrastructure spending going on, we decided to pick our theme was infrastructure and equity. And now we have a vision statement for what we're doing, right? That the work of inclusive economic development requires bold action, mobilizing narratives, community engagement, and alliances across unlikely partners. And we were thinking about that part with the regional work we were doing. But basically, it's going to take all of us to transform these legacy systems that we've inherited that unaltered will just keep reproducing this inequality. And we want to be a place where we can come together to learn about cutting-edge practices and scholarship, but the mode we're in is to develop insight, analysis, and models for action. And so, organizing around this theme, we went back to some of the early work, the early efforts to pull equity out of infrastructure development, which are those community benefit agreements. And having been in Los Angeles at UCLA when those first ones were architected through the Staples Center, I pulled in my UCLA network and then also some newer research on cities that are experimenting with citywide ordinances on community benefits. We looked at we interviewed people around transit and equity. We had a whole great discussion about community development organizations and are they democratic or not, and who's actually speaking for the community, and the whole political economy of development work. And learned about this new economic development tool called a neighborhood trust that's being experimented with in Philadelphia, where a neighborhood is setting up a trust whose purpose is to create wealth for the community, and they're buying up a whole mile of their commercial corridor. And it's not like a community land trust where you divide the land from the housing to create affordability. You could put the hottest restaurant in Philadelphia in your trust because the rent that they pay go into the trust, which flows to the neighborhood, and they can vote and use it for their purposes. So we were interested in that model. The city, we had heard, was interested in that model. So we designed a piece of our lab to explore that. And then we had some projects that we built out. And this was our most mature lab in that we had some projects that leaned very academic and then were shared out, like the Neighborhood Trust. We had others that felt more like a client project, like the Goth Street Armory. There's a community group that's been working for 7 years to try to get that kicked into an adaptive reuse. our students did some back of the envelope pro formas for that. And then for the Union Station project, Union Station's at the beginning of a redevelopment process. And so that was a kind of learning side by side where we met with them regularly and we shared what we were learning on the CBA's best practices. We did some local interviewing, and I think the most powerful recommendations we gave them were from those local stakeholders. So that's where we are. You can find our materials here. And I was going to end with a few questions, but I'm also happy to take that I would love to hear you think with me about, but I would also, I'm happy to just take any questions in the last 5 minutes that we have.
I have a question. As you know, there is a state law regarding affordable housing plans by each of Connecticut's municipalities, and a number of municipalities did not meet the deadline. There was not a short deadline, I think it was a long deadline. And your approach of looking at New Haven County, which is possibly a model, but if I look at the state as a whole, without having the data in front of me, Fairfield County seems to me to be quite resistant to rezoning and affordable housing plans. They're not the only towns, and I was wondering if you would use the same approach for that. I mean, how do you change, to me in a way, it gets down to the attitudes of the people in the governing structure. Mm-hmm. They don't want to change the local character. Mm-hmm. And you hear this over and over and over again. So how do you change that?
Well, what David Schleicher at the law school would say is you take the decision to a higher level. You don't, you have a decision happen at the county level or at the state level even. And so those kind of experiments we might see in some of the legislation out of California, where David consults a lot, but where you have certain kind of as a right development being articulated at the state level. And we are experimenting with that in Connecticut. Even that's very hard to get through in Connecticut. But this idea that near transit nodes within a mile, as a right, you could build a certain level of density that's not single family, that's multifamily. Even that is being heavily resisted in Connecticut. But that's one answer, is take the decision up a level to the state and create as of right zoning so that those local zoning boards have nothing, there's no process that they have a chance to intervene in, because as of right, certain amount of density is allowed. But right now, we're experimenting with that, and it's being heavily contested at the state level. I think the other tool we have in Connecticut that I've learned from my colleagues at the law school is that you can sue. I think it's called ADG regulation. You can sue if a town does not meet that 10% fair share affordable housing, and the developer can say they have a legal standing if the town hasn't met the 10% to pursue the development project. And there's a court that only hears those kind of cases, and that has produced a lot of breaking of those stalemate. It's been an effective regulatory tool.
Thank you.
Yes.
Could you say just a word about the new center for the University Center for Inclusive Development and how it came to be, its relationship with the work you're doing in the classroom?
Yes. Yes, my understanding is that the Center for Inclusive Growth is something that President Salovey initiated, partly as a response to the pressure from the city, but also as a response to the Yale and Slavery Report. So my partner is a history professor, and he worked on that Yale and Slavery Report and was part of so that makes it an interestingly positioned center.
Right. Yeah.
He appointed Kerwin Charles, our dean, to manage that center, to oversee it, and really not much other directive than that, although I think the idea is what I've heard more recently, it's really thinking about that conversation we had at the beginning of class. What is the role of a university in driving inclusive growth in its local community? Things like supplier procurement, workforce development. I think other things could grow from there, but from what I